We're going to walk through a handful of slides here, and before we get to some brief presentations from a couple of service providers, and then also then we're going to move to our panel debate and discussion. So for today's presentation, I wanted to just level set with one slide on a framework. Since the ETSI ZSM has their framework, I'll share the ACG framework, which I think align quite nicely, but just level set the discussion. And then I wanted to share the results, or at least pieces of the results, from two different projects we've been working on earlier this year with a couple of our clients, and we'll share the results from that. The first one is about some primary research we did regarding automation, and as part of a project we did with Sienna. And then the second one is we did a project with the Linux Foundation earlier this year about the impacts of open source on the service provider ecosystem, both the vendors and suppliers as well as the service providers themselves. From a framework perspective, we know that we have the concepts of templates and service definitions, and those service definitions are then feeding things that we talk about in the network called orchestrators or orchestration, along with then instantiating virtual functions or even network, physical network functions, and using SDN to largely control and guide those resources. The more interesting piece here on this slide is actually what's happening on the right, and part of what this whole ETSI ZSM forum is about, which is we're trying to automate things, but in order to automate things, we also, and it was touched on earlier, we also have to have some intelligent data to make some intelligent decisions. And so as we try to bring kind of closed loop automation to reality, we have to collect, measure, we have to analyze, we have to make some decisions, and then we can either inform the operator to do some manual intervention, which I think will occur in many cases early on, but ultimately turn that into a closed loop decision process where we let the system go ahead and make some corrective action or make some action, and then we measure and repeat the process all over again. As I already mentioned, this first project we're going to go through is around Sienna's launch of the adaptive network, and they sponsored the research, but it was independently executed by ACG Research, where we did a combination of both surveys as well as I conducted a collection of deep interviews and with multiple service providers talking about what they were thinking and what their challenges were and what they hope to accomplish in their automation journey. So the first data point that comes out, or the first two data points that's somewhat encouraging, is that over the course of the next 5 years, between 2018 and 2023, between 2018 and 2021, over a 3-year period of time, we're looking at a 30% expected growth in the investment that people are making in automation. So that's a good trend, and that's a positive. On the right-hand side, they're also obviously expecting to get some results from that investment, and the results they expect is that 75% of all respondents think that they will see significant or full automation occur over the next 5 years. And so I would argue that that's also quite encouraging. We can debate whether any of those numbers are optimistic or not optimistic, but just the fact that folks think they're going to increase their investment and they're expecting to achieve results from that are substantial, in my mind at least, is encouraging for where we're headed with closed loop automation. The next piece of this is, what do you hope to get from this investment from a motivations perspective? What's driving you and propelling you as a service provider or a large enterprise, because we also included large enterprises in this work? And the things that are top of mind and stand out here are certainly the idea of faster service delivery and faster time to revenue. Right below that then translates into improved customer satisfaction or net promoter scores, where companies and people have expectations about services being delivered faster and faster. When you think about your own video service from Netflix, or you think about using some cloud-based service, the ability to want that service and then actually turn that into a deliverable in a quick time frame is certainly an expectation that is happening. And so with closed loop automation and with further investments in automation, improved customer sat and net promoter score, as driven in part by faster service delivery, is certainly top of mind. And the other third piece then in this list is more new services faster, right? We know that part of the motivations are clearly, if I have a framework that will let me do it, I'd like to launch new services and I'd like to get them into the market as fast as I can to keep innovating. And then the fourth one there is agility and more agile business framework or business operations. I'll just say one other thing, which is cost is ever present, I think, in these analyses. But the one thing I heard from the interviews, and I really resonate with, is if a service provider or a large enterprise just wanted to obtain cost reductions, they certainly could do that. And whether that's through restructuring exercises or reorganization or beating up the suppliers for a price point, but that doesn't translate into better customer satisfaction. That doesn't necessarily translate into faster service delivery, a more agile business framework, and the rest. And so the maturity that I've seen come along in the last while, I'll say the last year or so, is that cost is certainly ever present, especially operational cost reductions. But by focusing on the top 4 items that are on this list, it's almost like the cost reductions come as a consequence versus flipping it the other way around. And from my perspective, at least, I think that's quite mature thinking and where people should be headed. We switch topics then a little bit and move to what are the items that are limiting progress in the adaptive network. So you're trying to go fast, you're trying to automate your network. What is holding you back? And top of mind that you'll see in this slide and the next slide, 2 things that really stand out are security and in general security concerns. The second item here is about the ability to, with your existing infrastructure and to obtain real-time information. But the third item here is the intelligence or analytics, machine learning, the ability to mine the data for nuggets of actionable intelligence that then you can do something with is certainly front and center and top of mind. And I'll say during the interviews and the other discussions, there's a lot of talk about skills gap and about folks having the right set of skills and competencies. We're looking at really a convergence of traditional networking, but also cloud and chief information officer type functions as well. And so there's really a confluence of those 2 skill sets, and people are concerned about the skills either in their own organization as a service provider or even in cases perhaps of their vendor community who's also supplying them with pieces of their overall solution. We flipped this question a little bit the other direction to see what we'd get as well, and that was, what are the key components to increase your network automation? So the prior question was about what is limiting your progress. The next question is, when you think about your solution, what are the key components that you think need to be there? And I'll just point out again, if you take a look at the top 2 items, what do you see? You see security and you see analytics, which is a a substitute for intelligence, or the ability to extract intelligent information from the data. And on the security side, one other comment I'll make is that people have a belief that they can use automation to help them secure their network and secure their data. However, there is a concern that if you don't get that right, and if you make some mistakes with automation, you could go from what would have been a bad situation where some data was exposed or there was a hole in your security perimeter, to now I've replicated that a lot of times really fast. And so there is some concerns around if I don't get the security framework right, if I don't lay out how I want this to automate, I could really get myself in more trouble faster than I even did in the past. And so it's a little bit of it cuts both ways, I would argue. But certainly people are very hopeful and optimistic about automation helping improve the security perimeter and protecting the data and the network. That's it for the automation project. I'll shift gears here to the second project that we executed, and I'll tell you here, I put the 2 hypertext links in here, and these slides are available after the presentation from the Layer 123. If you click on these, you'll see that there's a 48-page paper available for download, and be careful when reading it. You don't want to be driving or anything. You might go to sleep or something. But it's just lots of good information. We tried to cover a range of topics, and the scope of this has the potential to be so big that we focused on 3 areas of the network. We focused on the packet transport infrastructure. Think, routers and switches in the network, and switches inside the data center. So data center switching and transport switching was the infrastructure side. Then we focused on an SDN control layer on top of that, and then we focused on an orchestration layer. And we did that simply to bound the scope of the research at this time, versus just getting too unwieldy and too beyond our ability to manage it. The other thing we did was we wanted to talk to service providers and the vendor community supporting them, and we also wanted to talk to vendors who were born in the era of open source versus vendors who have been around for a long time and are now adapting to open source versus a startup based on open source. And that's where you see diversified portfolio company or open source portfolio company. We made a distinguishing factor about which type of vendor this is we're talking to. And this entire research was done with extensive multi-hour long interviews with executives inside of the service provider community globally, and executives inside of the vendor community and the ecosystem serving the service providers. Let's take a look at, I think I have 2 slides here from the report. First, let's start with the motivations piece of this. And on the motivations side, we certainly heard over and over again from the service provider community that there were really 3 key motivations that move to the top of this, which is in the use of open source. What are your motivations? And it is, as an industry, we can no longer afford competitively and financially to solve all of our problems as independent service providers. The world is global. The web scale competition is global with over-the-top services in many cases. And so as a service provider in isolation, I can no longer afford competitively or financially to solve all these problems myself independently and do that over and over again as service providers. So the idea of unifying approaches definitely resonates, and it's around getting the collection of service providers to align resources and development activities around that. The second piece of this is certainly about lock-in. And it's not that the service providers necessarily want to flip or change their vendors every 12 months. But what they do want is the option to do so and the opportunity to do so if their current vendors don't continue to ideate with them and continue to evolve with them and perform with them and not be locked into an unsatisfactory condition that is just too hard for the service providers to change. And then the third one that rises to the top here is around access to a broader talent pool. That definitely comes up over and over again, which is if I can reach across vendors and reach across the ecosystem, I can put together a really amazing team of talent in an open software development environment, and from that I can build something stronger than I could with any individual vendor, perhaps. This slide's pretty busy, and you can read more about it certainly in the paper, but I wanted to highlight 4 pieces that, at least for me, stuck out as we did the research, and we're using a Harvey Ball technique for how we're conveying this information. But the message to vendors isn't we, the service providers, are going to go it alone and we're going to do this open source and we don't need you any longer. The message is we do need you, we want you, and in fact we intend to get the software or the other components. We intend to get that still through the vendor community because we want the support and we want the capability. But we want you to do that in a collaborative, open system type of way. The other, next on the list, the other piece is, we certainly heard this as well, which is, the maturity of open source software, at least initially, is just less mature than you would get from a vertically integrated vendor deliverable. I don't think that's a surprise to probably any of us here, but it is interesting, and in general, service providers are adding software test resources and spending more money on software test initially to ensure quality in that software than they would, again, if it came through a vendor-only kind of relationship. Next is some of the financial numbers, and there's certainly lots of hope and the motivations around why this is being pursued. But I'll just say the one that I circled here is, does the use of open source change the revenue picture? And I'll just say the answer, honestly, is the jury is still out, and the results remain to be seen. People hope that because you're using open source and because you're going faster and because you have an ecosystem of developers and all of that, that you will derive lower costs and potentially increased revenue. But we're early, and it's early days, and the honest answer is we'll have to see. And then the last piece was, how does open source reflect your competitiveness one way or the other? And the answer here resoundingly was that service providers believe that the use of open source does enhance their competitive position because they can iterate more quickly, they can play in a sandbox with some innovation opportunities, and do that faster and at lower cost than they would have potentially been able to do without having the open source community available. Just one other comment was engineers overwhelmingly like working on open source projects. You all already know this quite well, but there's certainly a sense of industry camaraderie and a feeling that you're a part of something bigger than your individual vendor or your individual project, and engineers love that cross-vendor, cross-industry collaboration almost universally, and that certainly came out loud and clear. That's it for my formal slides here, and I am 2 seconds over, so I apologize for that. Next up on the agenda, we're going to have Oliver Cantor from Verizon come up and share 2 slides with us, and then Klaus from DT is going to do the same, and then we'll turn to the vendor panel and vendor service provider panel, and I'll lead a moderated session where we'll hopefully have a really nice dialogue and discussion about the journey toward automation. With that, I think I'll hand it to Narit for an introduction for Oliver here. Thank you all.